This is a video series I know people have been wanting from me for a while. I've seen the whole Boondocks retrospective thing, and it's cool. But I want to take it a step further. A step back, perhaps. Before the reboot, before the movie, before the show, maybe even before the comics, before the Boondocks. I want to chronicle the journey of the Boondocks and how it was created. This was originally a documentary project that I'm turning into a video series because we've got all these notes and it doesn't make sense not to use them. We did a bunch of interviews for this. We spoke to a lot of people on the team about this. It's been a long time coming. I'm very excited to share with you some of the stuff that we managed to archive. Yeah, it's going to be a big video. It's going to be a really big video. I'm not used to this. I need to stress that this is not my style. I'm going to try and make it as visually stimulating as I can though. A final point before I begin. The purpose of this video is to be both informative and opinionated. There will be citations in the description if you just want pure information. This video will be a mix of both of these things. With that said, let's get started. Who is Aaron McGruder? In 1993, when he started thinking of launching his own comic strip, he wanted to satirize why many blacks and some whites think the only real black people are poor and from the city. So he set the Boondocks in a white neighborhood because that's where I'm from and that's what I knew. Our adventure started in 1993. Aaron McGruder is 18 years old. Is he? He is, yeah. Aaron McGruder is 18 years old. At this point, he spent some time growing up in Chicago, but not very much. A majority of his upbringing was spent in an all-white neighborhood of Maryland. He attended a Jesuit school growing up and for the most part, felt like a social outcast of sorts. It's this upbringing that paved the way for the idea of the Boondocks. Not just in how he moved from a black neighborhood to a mostly white one, but also in how he was perceived by both black people in the city and white people from his own neighborhood. Everything in hip-hop was street and ghetto and hard, McGruder says. I didn't want to be fake. There's always a certain number of black people from the suburbs who really pretend like they're living in the city. It's this notion that you're only truly black if you're from the city and you're poor. I want you to put a pin in that because it's going to inform a lot of the decisions and ideas I think were made around this series. Initially, before the Boondocks was a thing, Aaron wanted to work on the milestone DC Comics. It was a superhero comic which inspired him to work with comics. The comic strip had elements of politics, but it was more focused on the interracial and intraracial relations in a mostly white suburb. According to Aaron, this is because the Boondocks is inspired by hip-hop, the golden era, so to speak. This music that inspired the strip were overtly political artists. Aaron McGruder's left-wing politics were heavily shaped by the culture of hip-hop that he grew up with in the kind of late 80s to early 90s. In an interview with R.C. Harvey for the September 2003 Comics Journal, he says, "My political perspectives as a young adult were shaped by hip-hop's political era, which was 1987 to 1992, roughly when I was in junior high to high school. We had Public Enemy, KRS-One, X-Clan, Brand Nubian, all of these overtly political groups." Aaron claims the Boondocks was always supposed to be a hip-hop strip, a friend of hip-hop. This is because the political era of hip-hop not only shaped who he was in high school, but set him on the path that he's been on ever since. It was more than that. It was actual black nationalism. It was radical socialism. There was no black leadership supplying these political ideals to the next generation, and what very few there were, a lot of us, particularly those of us who grew up in the suburbs, discovered that through hip-hop. This paints a very interesting picture, because it speaks to how Aaron's experiences and media influence shaped how he views the world, and by extension, how the views of the main character, Huey, would eventually come to be. McGruder's was a fairly typical, well-adjusted 80s childhood. He had typical interests: Star Wars, Charlie Brown, Kung Fu. He went to a Jesuit school, a very strict, very, very white Jesuit school, outside Columbia from the 7th to 9th grade. Those were the most oppressive years of my life, he told me. Huey and Riley, not coincidentally, attend J. Edgar Hoover Elementary. When we were younger and in high school, we didn't understand that Chuck D wasn't a political leader. He was a rapper, and we kind of looked at him as like a political leader. But before we keep going, let's take a moment to dissect this. Aaron didn't spend a lot of time in Chicago, but very much implies some insecurities about the validity of his blackness. This makes sense. He was in his teens and surrounded by white people, and all he had was the media he consumed. This was the 80s too. He talks about how white and oppressive his school life was, and how his escapes and making sense of that was through the political era of hip-hop. And you'll notice this fascination with hip-hop, specifically this one era, is a big element of not only Huey's character, but also critiquing the direction hip-hop would eventually lean to. Because for better or worse, these experiences are a big part of how Aaron made sense of his blackness, and by extension, his identity. The Boondocks had a website made, and Aaron is still trying to get his comic strip picked up for syndication. On his page, he writes a very long piece about what the Boondocks is, and what it meant to him to create it. It's very long, but because I think it's unbelievably important for what I'm going to talk about now and later down the line in the series, I'm gonna read it. Its foundations and influences lay firmly at the cross-section of young black culture, rarely seen, far away from the urban streets which usually serve as a backdrop for black youth. It's a story of a handful of kids from various parts of the country who find themselves transplanted, with their families, to a newly integrated upscale neighborhood on the East Coast. The kids are forced to make the adjustment to suburban life, an essentially alien environment, with little more than one another for support. The story of these youngsters becomes symbolic of the interracial and intraracial relationships within America, a vehicle for social and cultural commentary, as well as an allegory for the young hip-hop generation struggling to find a place and an identity in the larger, wider world. The Boondocks is satire and silliness, drama and politics, and hip-hop. It is a mature look at the world and at ourselves through the innocent and nonetheless astute eyes of its young cast. It is an opportunity to express myself through a medium that has taught me so much, to which I am forever thankful. It is a depiction of black youth simply as likable kids, without deracializing them or avoiding politically charged topics. Finally, it is a reminder of how cute we all were when we were young. There's a lot that can be said about this piece. Aaron made it clear that the Boondocks was a labor of love to a degree, and he threw in examples like seeing his anxieties through Charlie Brown and living his childhood through Calvin. Essentially, he wanted the Boondocks to be a mirror for black youth and society, to explore their experiences and be something that they could relate to both as adults and as children. He saw comic strips as a sophisticated medium through their ability to do this. But if you've been paying attention, this piece makes it clear that Aaron is also talking about himself. On the website you can see links to Calvin and Hobbes and the Peanuts. The Boondocks references the Peanuts even in the show. It's a Huey Freeman Christmas. It's a Black President Huey Freeman. These are Charlie Brown episode titles, at least in how they're structured. He even spoke about wanting to make specials in the vein of Charlie Brown. Anyone that's seen Charlie Brown knows that Charlie Brown could be very, let's say, pessimistic. Charlie Brown isn't happy. People are mean to him. He has massive insecurities about being liked and being accepted and being a leader. It's not really your traditional children's series. And yet, Aaron says he relates to it. And given how he speaks on his upbringing, it's not difficult to see why. The original website has a links page and it's citing a bunch of different artists. One of them is The Unspoken Herd, Asheru, who eventually goes on to write the theme song for the Boondocks series. I love this stuff, I really recommend it. This is some great stuff. It has hip hop recommendations, even the Soul Controllers Mix Show. That was a show where Aaron was a DJ, so his influence and palette where it comes to music had to be at least a little diverse, right? He had to look around a little bit, right? He was on the Hitlist.com and produced some of the comic strips there. There's even some original content that's completely in color. And finally, we have the Diamondback. Aaron attended the University of Maryland and even tried to drop out at some point to do the comic. He had a segment called, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna try my best to say this, What's Your Nuggets? That's what he called it. Yeah, right, that's what he said. I don't know. That's what you want to do. Where he would speak not only about his blackness on campus, but his experiences and even his love of Star Wars. I don't want to get into that now because it's a very long story, but just know that Aaron has been an insane lover of Star Wars for years. He has memorabilia. It's a big thing. It's a whole thing, right? The comic strip jumps to a series of different places. It starts on the hitlist.com and then it finds a home on the source, but Aaron felt like people didn't read it. It was on the Diamondback and there was this professional oops printed where Aaron's comic was supposed to be. It was a weird thing. I think there was a beef with like the publisher or the editor, I'm not sure. But ultimately, Aaron stops printing his comic there as a result. There's a few exclusive comic strips here too. There was a very clear campaign and effort to get the Boondocks syndicated. They even asked their readers to write in so the Boondocks could be picked up. I should probably explain now who they are. The creator, Aaron McGruder. He describes himself as a little too lonely, a bit self-deprecating there, Aaron, but again, this will be the beginning of a bit of a trend. He brings up how people view him as a hater for not liking Puffy, a big part of the comic strip, and lastly, how much money he spends on Star Wars. Nothing particularly new or interesting though. Executive producer Reginald Hudlin.
I mean, it really summed it all up. I mean, yeah, no, it worked really well. Ooh, we all know him.
Hold on, my name is coming.
This is where it gets kind of interesting. Yes, this is the same one, same guy from the BET episode. It's him. What's interesting here is that Reginald Hudlin is cited as the executive producer even before syndication. In Aaron's bio, he brings up his lawyer, and later on in the credits of the show, he would say that Reginald Hudlin legally had to be credited as the executive producer of the series for the first 2 seasons. So it's very likely that even before syndication, Reginald Hudlin had himself signed as the Boondocks' executive producer. In fact, he says so himself on his website. I met Aaron before he graduated from college. He was doing his deal for the Boondocks to be nationally syndicated in newspapers, and since we had the same lawyer, we were introduced because of my knowledge of comic-related stuff. In his bio, the standout parts is that he describes his city as the blackest in America. It's also worth noting that they're writing about Reginald Hudlin's work with John Witherspoon, Eddie Murphy, and Samuel Jackson, all people that, at least to some capacity, would be involved in the eventual TV show. In fact, the television deal seems to be a big part of what Reginald Hudlin's role was. I also sent him many screenplays so we could learn the form, and introduced to all of Hollywood, from studio to network heads and stars like Samuel Jackson, Chris Rock, John Witherspoon, and people that ended up being on the cast for the show. In the meantime, I convinced my girlfriend, later my wife, that Aaron could be a media figure. She got articles about him placed in the New York Times Magazine, Time, The New Yorker, etc. This is an interesting element that once again will come into play later in this series, but for now, what's important is that Reginald Hudlin was Aaron's gateway into Hollywood. Maybe not in the form of an immediate TV deal, but an introduction to the world at large. Finally, we have Rome. He goes by DJ Stylist now, but at the time, he helped Aaron manage his website. There's not much information on him other than the fact that they worked together quite a bit, and he has a very clear idea of the things that Aaron wanted to say, even if to just some capacity, right? Even going as far to clarify some of Aaron's comic strips where people missed what he was trying to communicate. And with that, we should be done, right? We should be at syndication. No more history. We can talk about the strip. No. We talked a lot about what the Boondocks is supposed to be and the staff behind it and the build up to it being created, but what actually is it? Who are these characters? Who are these characters that we are going to see depicted to begin with? Hey guys, I hate doing this, but it's the YouTube thing and you're supposed to do it. One, if you're enjoying the video, try to press subscribe, it'd be really cool. Subscribe to the video if you're really enjoying it. If you want to support more content like this, or you want previews for the next episode, you can support me on Patreon. It supports me, it supports the video game I'm working on, and helps me pay my artists, so I can get more stuff out and, you know, keep working on that. It helps me like give resources to people that need it, whether that's through an org or like doing some form of mutual aid. And yeah, I'll try to keep you guys always in the loop on what's going on there. Otherwise, technically speaking, thank you guys so much for checking out the video. I'm not gonna eat up too much of your time. I hate plugs. So yeah, do what you can. Alright, take care. Peace. The Boondocks takes place in Maryland. It's not even subtle about it. The most absurd part of this series is the children, but the world around them remains mostly grounded. What's interesting is before Woodcrest, it went by a different name, Hazelcrest. It's unclear why Aaron changed the name, but some remnants of the idea are present within the website. More on that in a second. Huey. There will be a lot to say about Huey as this series progresses, so for now, instead of looking at what he could be, I'm going to look at him as Aaron describes and depicted him at this point. Huey R. Freeman. Nobody knows what the R stands for, Radical, Robert, it's never really made clear. But it's definitely another nod to Huey P. Newton. Huey's born in Chicago. His age isn't specified, much like the rest of the cast. He's a radical, scholar, and philosopher. These are very weird ways to describe your main character, and it's pretty abstract if you want me to be blunt. Huey's called a radical in relation to his progressive politics and the idea that he's extreme. He's called a scholar because he's well-read, and a philosopher because, well, I guess he's smart, I guess. I don't know. It might sound like I'm undercutting that, but it's because what's richer is Huey's political philosophy. It's defined as black nationalism. Alright guys, welcome to our first ever free Huey flashcard. Are you ready? Let's go. What is black nationalism? Black nationalism has various forms and interpretations, but it's ultimately cultivating and protecting black communities outside a Eurocentric institution or society. Regardless of what you may have seen online by people, at its core, this is what black nationalism is. It came about in response to colonialism and slavery, which is what makes it different from different ideas of nationalism. A question that must always be asked in relation to nationalism is, where does this idea of building a nation come from? The oppressed build these nations out of a need to protect their identities, cultural heritage, and to properly ensure their growth. Those with power don't. That's the difference. This is going to be a developing story in the next episode, but for now, our understanding of Huey is that he's pro-black and anti-authoritarian. Even some of the books he's reading aren't actually real, but speak to his desire to protect himself from white conservative institutions, and the impact that they may have on the way he views himself and the world around him. Again, isn't unfounded. A final point on Huey for this section is that there's a real point made to explore and blur the lines between what is his childlike imagination and the reality of the black experience under white supremacy. The irony often being that despite both being quite outlandish, there's a lot of truth to it. And just as hearing a child like Huey say these things is uncomfortable, so is the harsh reality of the black experience. Though he didn't feel exactly the same as Huey and the gang, who were desperately clinging to their urban roots, he did feel their isolation. The cartoonist says that Huey is probably a lot more like him when he was attending the University of Maryland at College Park. Huey, he says, is who he would have been at the age of 8 if he'd known all the things he knows now about civil rights history, militant philosophies, and racial stereotyping. This is the closest Aaron ever gets to admitting that Huey is effectively his alter ego. There's even a panel where Huey asks for an Afro-American studies class, something that Aaron was actually studying at the time. But again, more on this at a later time. The last thing the bio mentions is that he practices Tai Chi and mainly resides on Ghetto Hill. The idea that Huey is a martial artist is one that we'll explore later, but Ghetto Hill? What? I don't know what Ghetto Hill is. What is that? What are you talking about? It's kind of implied to be the hill that Huey is constantly seen on, even in the show. It's interesting to think at one point it even had a name, though Ghetto Hill was really on the nose, and I'm kind of glad it didn't stick around. Riley. If Huey is the lens to which we see and interact with this world, then Riley is what we're seeing through that lens to begin with. Because The Boondocks is mostly grounded in reality, it's pretty easy to see what Riley's concept was after. He goes by Riley Smalls, Riley Escobar, Riley Capone. Riley is drawing from mob bosses and gangster movies, specifically the influence they had on the direction of hip-hop in the 90s. Riley Escobar is a reference to Nas, who went by Nas Escobar. Riley Smalls is a reference to Biggie, who named himself Biggie Smalls after a comedy gangster movie. Everything in hip-hop was street and ghetto and hard. I didn't want to be fake. There's always a certain number of black people from the suburbs that really pretend like they're living in the city. It's this notion that you're only truly black if you're from the city and you're poor. According to Aaron McGruder, part of the idea for the Boondocks came in 1993, where he felt like rap and hip-hop had taken a gangster lean, that he found destructive and wanted to parody. The Boondocks, at its core, was a hip-hop strip. This is something I find really fascinating, in that Huey and Riley conceptually are really just supposed to represent two different eras of hip-hop. Huey is the late 80s with Chuck D and Public Enemy and X-Clan, this political era of hip-hop, and Riley is the mid-90s. He represents the commercial transition that hip-hop took, hence why he names himself after Nas and screams out lyrics from P. Diddy. There's something to be said about this though. Aaron, for all intensive purposes, and while he still had very overt experiences with race given his upbringing, he makes it very clear he made sense of his blackness through hip-hop. Just as there's something to criticize and be said about how hip-hop veered away from black radical tradition to commercial luxury and crime, there's something also to be said about Riley acting as a moving goalpost of things to criticize. There's something to be said about how the Boondocks went on to tackle different types of black people. For now though, Riley's just a 90s kid. A final detail that I like is the idea of Riley using toy water guns. I like that Riley uses toys and water guns. It emphasizes his youth and childishness. If you were to give Riley a real weapon, it undermines the point of how cute and innocent he's supposed to be. Without saying too much. Or maybe I've already said too much. Maybe you already can guess. I don't know. Of course, you probably can. Alright. Caesar. Caesar's personal hero is listed as Speed Racer. He loves Speed Racer, and if it isn't obvious from the time period, he's very obviously inspired by the movie Akira. His red big wheel is this little tricycle he rides around the neighborhood. It's one of the most prominent elements of Caesar's character. One of the most prominent elements of Caesar's character is his love for Brooklyn. This is another very obvious nod to how Aaron described the Boondocks as a hip-hop strip, given how much East Coast hip-hop found its origins and early foundations in the Bronx. This is very well-cited stuff, I don't need to go too crazy on it, but again, Brooklyn and hip-hop have a very strong history. It also says that he's really big into candy, video games, and chasing asses. This is interesting because outside some Halloween strips, he's never seen eating or talking about candy. He's also never seen playing any video games. Oddly enough, he spends more time depicted playing sports. You can even see him kicking a ball on Ghetto Hill. Oh, that name sucks. Oh, that name sucks so much. It's pretty bad. Here, he's even playing golf. What kind of tag words? Been mentioned that he wants to be an MC or a comedian or an entertainer. It's a bit telling that these elements of his character either aren't mentioned or don't play a role in any of his appearances. I'm gonna save my full thoughts on Michael Caesar when we get to the 2000s, but he definitely does feel like the most relatable character. And I think a big element is that he's not as extreme as Huey O'Reilly. He's goofy and carefree. He tries to mind control his teacher into giving him an A because it's in Star Wars. When his teacher is trying to learn AAVE, he's giving backseat commentary. In fact, he's kind of just presented as this cool black media nerd. It's a shame he didn't make it into the show, but again, a later time, a later day. In fact, he's kind of just presented as this cool black media nerd. Jasmine. Okay, so I haven't given my thoughts on some of these designs because for the most part, there's not much to say, to be honest. But Jasmine's hair goes through so many different design changes, and I can see why they changed it, given that part of her character arc is Afro-denial, and it'd be pretty difficult to depict his haircut in a newspaper. Some details. It says she was born outside Washington, D.C., and makes a point to emphasize that she was born to an interracial couple, and makes a point to make it clear that he's ignorant of the outside world. I don't have much to say here because Jasmine doesn't appear on the hit list, and only shows up in the introduction to the Diamondback when Aaron eventually pulls the strip. What I will say is that 1, this reference to Mariah Carey is ever present in this series, and 2, by emphasizing that Jasmine's family is liberal, you create a very clear distinction to Huey's more radical left politics. A new face appears, Isis. I can't say too much. I can't say that too much in this video or I'll get demonetized, but it's the name. That's the name of the character, right? She's the first character we hear of several times, but never actually appears. There's all this concept art of her. She has a page dedicated to her on the FAQ, but she's never actually depicted on the Diamondback or the hit list. She lives and dies on this page, so this is kind of all we have to work with. She's from Atlanta, Georgia. She likes dancing and hosts the only black women's council in the area. That's it. The bio kind of makes it sound like she's the group's mom, but some of the dynamics sounds a bit interesting, right? When asked, Aaron described her as an integral character, stating that she would be one of the last characters introduced. She just needed to be redesigned. She never appears, but this idea of Aaron spacing out the character appearances is true. Caesar was always supposed to take a year to be introduced. It's like, make the most of the characters before you just start dumping things on people. I understand, it makes sense. There's not much I can say about a character that has never appeared, but I do like her design. I don't really like the idea that she just kind of exists to temper people though, but I do like the idea of her being the only member of her own council. You could easily explore the isolation of a black woman in relation to how little solidarity and support is actually shown to them. It feels like, to me, a lot of her character traits were kind of just assimilated into Huey. Even this idea of having a council or a network or a platform is brought up in both the strip and the show. It's a shame to not have a black woman within the Boondocks, but I think the concept Aaron came up with didn't have much in the way of intrigue to begin with. Even the ideas I'm presenting are just ideas, because it's very hard to say what this character would have been about. Under the section that would communicate something about these characters, all she has is being chased by Caesar, which doesn't say a whole lot. She likes to dance, but there's no indication of what she likes to dance to. It's not even a thing where you can draw back to it being a hip-hop strip. It's just we don't know. Aaron said he might wait for the show, but as we all know, that really didn't end up happening. That does it for the main cast. So, syndication. Nah. Haro Tomo. Haro is a character that I have no idea was even featured in the comic strip, but there's some information about him out there. And one of the big ones is Haro didn't speak. He only communicated with gestures. It's hard to say if this was like a stereotype or like a Peanuts thing. Aaron was really inspired by the Peanuts, so maybe Aaron wanted a character that could be funny in only what they do. It's also brought up that Hiro was a master with Turntable Bushido. He was a DJ. So if you were to ask me, this is why Hiro was a difficult character to work with within the comic strip. He relies heavily on music, and in a print medium, there's a limit to how you can showcase a character like this. Not impossible. In fact, I think this character could have really worked. Think, the piano from the Peanuts, but this is a character that makes a lot more sense on TV. I think the existence of this character complements the idea that Isis liked to dance, or Jasmine liking Mariah Carey, and all these different characters having different tastes in music. If there's genuinely a character that I think is a shame never made it into the show, I think it's Hiro, because he opens the door for the other characters to do stuff. He's also he sounds like a very animation friendly character, like it sounds like it could be really cool. Anyway, talking too much. The only information we can glean is from the official Boondocks merchandise at the time, which... Okay, so ignoring all of this, Hiro has a Bruce Lee shirt on. This is another element that gets assimilated into Huey's character. If you're noticing a trend, I think a lot of these conceptual characters end up being assimilated into Huey. Finally, we have the main man, Grits. We don't know anything about Grits. He's from Kentucky, and he was considered white trash, and he enjoys hunting. That's it, man. I don't know what to tell you. To be honest, I don't know. It's nothing. Grits didn't do anything. John Hazel. So it's called Hazelcrest for a reason. There was a character conceptualized called John Hazel. He was the original bad guy who pushed back against having black people in Hazelcrest. He clearly has some relation to the suburb. He was probably really wealthy, and, well, he kind of sounds like a mix between Ruckus and Ed Wuncler. Aaron stated several times he had an idea for Ruckus way back when conceptualizing the strip, and this is the closest thing we have to him. So it's very likely that John Hazel was the Ruckus before Ruckus. Some interesting things to think about. After a long time trying, finally, Universal Press picked up what we know now as the Boondocks. The rest is history. Finally, we can talk about it.
Mixtapes, news, nightmare.
The story of the ghetto. I've seen too much crime. I've never seen a meadow. With stress on the mind, it's hard to stay mellow. You step outside, you've got a duck flying metal. For surviving that shit, should've got a medal. A fat ass chick and a hooker in stilettos. A brand new whip, and when I jump out of it, every step that I take, I'm crushing the rose pedal. I'm light on my feet, dancing with the devil.
Okay, now we can talk about the syndicated strip. I did tell you this was going to be a long one, and I need to stress this isn't even going to be the full strip, just some of the 1999 run. Gotta keep you guys coming back somehow, and I hate making long videos. I am screaming while editing this video, I know I am. Our series begins with an introduction to the world of Woodcrest, a mostly white suburb based in Maryland, effectively where Aaron grew up. The opening strip does almost everything to characterize the world and the situation. In one strip, Huey explains where they came from and why this feels different, and makes a very clear distinction between the two. Huey is saying everything but, in direct words, we're in a white neighborhood now. He says these people to differentiate himself from those who are well off and comfortable, and they are not the same. Having Riley childishly misunderstand this says quite a bit about Riley's maturity. But also in letting Huey be the one to communicate this difference, tells us a lot about how Huey understands things. It helps that Huey's afro is loud and takes up a large amount of the page. This stuff might sound really silly to point out now, but you have to understand that this is the debut of these characters to this world. There's no show or interviews to base this off. All you have is this interaction, and I think it does a pretty good job. Our next strip is more of a piece. This is something that Aaron kind of rarely does, but he seems to be making an effort to show what this world looks like. The joke here is obvious. Aaron's making a point that this is more of a suburban area with more trees and woods, and the air is more pure, and the kids aren't used to it. This time we're introduced to Grandad. Yes, this guy had no bio, no build-up, nothing. It wasn't until the syndication that we had any documented appearance of him. This panel is one of the most interesting in terms of characterizing Huey. It's the first time we see the goofier side to the character. Huey tries to act like a big brother figure to Riley to help him make sense of the world, but he lets his childish side come out with Grandad. The joke here with Bull Connor is also interesting because, like, that's what Bull Connor actually did. But also it establishes a very clear racial dynamic more explicitly in the comic, both in Huey's beliefs but also how he views the police. Finally, I think Grandad's response here is really interesting. I never should have let that boy watch Eyes on the Prize. Eyes on the Prize was a documentary series about the civil rights movement. It can be interpreted multiple ways depending on who you ask. One, it could be looked at as Grandad being dismissive of how Huey feels here. Two, he could be attributing Huey's fear of moving to a new neighborhood to recently seeing the documentary. Or the third, and in my opinion the most interesting interpretation, he feels like exposing Huey to these things at such a young age has made him paranoid and hyper-aware of racial dynamics, to the point where he finds it difficult to keep an open mind. Regardless of how you interpret the scene, I think it's interesting to think about. This is the first really wordy comic strip. Get used to that. Oh my god. You know, I'm sorry. But yeah, this is the first really wordy comic strip. But it doesn't mean the artwork doesn't still look good. Particularly, I really like this close-up of Grandad. It might sound like I'm being pedantic, but I really do appreciate it when it's like this. It's not going to be like this the whole time. The two big revelations here is how Grandad feels to the move compared to the kids. He's the first character to be direct about how his blackness affected his lifestyle. It lets you sympathize with what Grandad ultimately wants for himself, a peaceful retirement. It's also made clear that he doesn't care about how Huey and Riley feels to this. This generation gap is an interesting element of their relationship. The kids don't understand why Grandad wants this, the same way Grandad doesn't understand why distancing themselves from other black people feels like stripping away a part of who they are. This is the first display of Huey's delusions of grandeur. He's very clearly well educated about how white supremacy has vilified blackness, and his pride in who he is admirable here, albeit a little narcissistic. He's brooding on a hill like a superhero, but an old white woman doesn't take him seriously. This actually extends to the next strip, with a similar punchline, "I'm not your pet Negro." It's interesting that Huey makes a point to differentiate himself from other black culture figures in the media, even talking about how being emasculated is a big part of how black people are accepted into the white media. These strips serve two very distinct purposes. One, Aaron is making it clear to his audience that he doesn't want Huey to be seen this way. Two, it's kind of a knock on how Aaron thinks white people sees these characters. Now we're on our first Sunday panel, and it's kind of a retread on the first strip on the 19th of April, but with a different kind of joke. Riley's commenting on how different black neighborhoods are from suburbia. That's pretty much it. This is another example of Aaron really playing with the art to show off the world. The only thing this strip is here to establish is that Huey and Riley are on the same page with not wanting to be there. Here, we're about to be introduced to the Dubois family. Huey's shocked at an interracial relationship, and there's a Bob Ross reference. We meet Jasmine, a biracial girl whose interaction with Huey goes about as well as you think it did. Things to note here is that Huey references Mariah Carey, Jasmine's favorite artist, who's also biracial, but he also throws a reference to Angela Davis, Angela Davis being one of the members of the Black Panther Party and a black radical scholar. we're introduced to our first story of the comic strip, Jasmine's Afro denial. This is going to be a lingering story. I'm just going to tell you now. Jasmine does everything in her power to deny her blackness. She makes an effort to single out every aspect of her lineage, and this is very clearly Aaron kind of taking a knock at this idea. Huey continues to make fun of the idea, calling Richard Roundtree from Shaft in Africa. It feels like a good point to note that the Boondocks at this point is very referential, probably to make clear to its audience how diverse its palette of black culture and media is. It's also worth knowing that Jasmine is the first character to vocally not get any of these references. As we'll eventually find out, Jasmine hasn't been properly educated in her black identity, and this is Aaron's little way of kind of hinting at that. Suddenly the comic strip is being a bit more overt with how racialized it is, going back to this idea that they're not shying away from that conversation. Even feeding into the next strip, there's more of a point being made that Riley understands the world through TV and the media he's consumed. Huey's comments on UPN are also the first time we get a knock on what's defined as black entertainment. It's also worth knowing that Riley seems a bit more inquisitive early on. Like he's actually trying to make sense of the world through Huey and asking him a lot of questions. It just feels like their relationship is much healthier thus far. But I think that's just because they see eye to eye on how they feel moving to Woodcrest. I like some of the expressions here. Another really great Sunday. A little known fun fact, there was actually a competition to see who could submit the best fug mug to boondocks.net. Here are some examples of how people did. I don't understand it. We're introduced to Thomas Dubois, Jasmine's dad, and we effectively get a gleam into her parental life. Huey wastes no time establishing once again that Huey is supposed to be a specific era of black politics and hip-hop. He explains verbatim that he's named after Huey P. Newton. It feels very meta, to be honest. It feels really meta. We return to Jasmine, and she's still making a point of refusing to identify with her blackness. It's interesting here that Jasmine makes a point to not identify with her whiteness either. To her, it's picking between parents. This obviously doesn't make much sense, but it does make sense of how Jasmine sees the situation. She conflates her racial identity with her love of her parents, and because she loves them both equally, she refuses to choose. It's also worth exploring what Huey has been trying to communicate versus how he's actually coming off. Huey's jokes are making multiple points. One, Huey doesn't understand why Jasmine would hold on to whiteness as an identity. Another point being made covertly is that Huey has seen Jasmine's afro and immediately labeled her as black. Regardless of whether it's his right to do this, Jasmine has no say in how her racial identity is perceived. More on this later. Huey makes an effort to sympathize with Jasmine, but this is a comic strip and we need a punchline. Michael Bolton and Kenny G were two white artists that were very well known for appropriating black music and styles, in a similar vein of Elvis Presley. Based on that and a statement by Aaron, I don't think Huey's making this story up. If it's true, then the point Huey is making is clear. Due to the household, his friend was given a diluted idea of blackness as a result, and as we'll soon find out, that's one of Huey's biggest fears. It's interesting that Jasmine doesn't see Huey as a friend at this point, but now we're introduced to Cindy, a white girl that's been present in the strip in many of its earlier conceptual forms, but doesn't have a bio on the website. John Hazel died for this. She's so excited to be making friends and immediately gets caught off guard with Cindy's fascination with black people. This next strip is one of my favorites because it does a lot to characterize the both of them. Jasmine is struggling to get a word in, trying to communicate that she's also black. Cindy is treating Jasmine like just another white girl, exoticizing ideas of blackness she's seen in the media, casually communicating her dad's racist values, and this obviously makes Jasmine uncomfortable. A clear point is being made to separate Jasmine from Cindy. Yes, she's not as militant or politically savvy as Huey, but she recognizes the fears of her parents are horrible, and makes this separation clear by calling her lucky to not know. At this point in the narrative, it's clear that Jasmine isn't stupid. This scene is supposed to directly parallel Huey's. Huey is treating her as a black person, and Cindy is treating Jasmine as a white person. And due to Jasmine's timid and meek nature, we get a gleam into both perspectives here. It's our first look into how the neighborhood is receiving the idea of black people coming into the area, the internalized racist ideas within households, and how younger white people exoticize the lives of black people. One of the very things that Huey makes it clear he's uninterested in being. Aaron, this is your third Sunday, and you're making a Star Wars reference. Also Samuel Jackson, that's cool. I don't have much to say about that one, but yeah, this guy loves Star Wars. It's here that Jasmine doesn't say she's black. She says her dad is black, and then is compared to Mariah Carey. I'm noticing a trend here, but she notes that she's half black too. Cindy's colorblind comment is dismissed by Jasmine, not as a cheap punchline, but it feels like a jab at the I don't see color types. Based on what Cindy says here, we know that's not true. Another comment on the art, I really love this shot of Cindy looking over at Jasmine to reconfirm her blackness and Jasmine giving a really nervous smile. I think that's really cute. It's another point about how Cindy has gotten so much of her ideas of blackness from the media. This element of kids being very impressionable is a recurring theme. This is another angle I really like. Aaron really does try to present a sense of depth with these characters with the limited panel space, and I think for the most part it really does work, and I think that's mainly because of the very simple designs and shapes. This dynamic of Jasmine seeing unfiltered whiteness and unfiltered ideas of blackness is sadly one that doesn't really go anywhere, because this is one of the last times we see Jasmine and Cindy interact. Before we go into the next story arc, I think it's worth exploring what the reaction to the Boondocks has been at this point, because we've been looking at the Boondocks in isolation. What has the Boondocks established, and do I think the critiques early on were justified? Honestly, I would say no. I think a lot of the comic strip goes out of its way to establish very clear dynamics between the characters. Ryder got a lot of flack early on, for instance, but I think Aaron makes it very clear what his character is from jump. He's always asking Huey questions like a younger brother would, to understand the world around him, and tries to make sense of the neighborhood through white sitcoms. He tries to keep it real, but he's cursed with cuteness. Huey is also, at least implied, to have a very similar issue to Riley. In a way, he also wants to be taken very seriously, but looks too adorable to be taken that way. Grandad also implies that Huey is partially the way he is because of his namesake and watching black docuseries on TV. I've spoken about this in videos in the past, but a very clear point is being made to demonstrate how impressionable the young boys are, that they are products of the wider world and media. If there's something I think encompasses the entire stretch of the Boondocks franchise, it's being a massive critique of the media and how it affects the way young people see the world. So I think it's interesting that remnants of that are here. Finally, I want to talk about Jasmine. Earlier I referenced the idea that Jasmine refused to choose between racial categories, but both Huey and Cindy effectively decide for her, treating her as black and white respectively. She gets a gleam into two different ideas of blackness, but also how she'll be treated. Despite refusing to decide, it's made very clear that the world will decide for her. Be that unfair or otherwise, Jasmine is always going to grapple with that perception until she chooses to identify. But I also think a point is also being made about how race is often about perception. Race in it of itself is a social construct. Negroes and Hamites were distinguished only by their dark complexions and the size of their noses. The Bacon's Rebellion created the labels of black and white strictly to destabilize multiracial unions. While white supremacy and by extension anti-blackness is global, different countries and nations have different ideas of what it even means to be black. What even constitutes as blackness? That's not even like a fixed thing for a lot of people. Like it's a very complicated concept. I think Jasmine is a commentary on the confusion surrounding W.E.B. Du Bois's colorline theory. Absolutely. But it's almost compounded by how little say she has in how she's actually perceived. And this is, again, a very recurring thing with these characters, whether it's Jasmine, Huey, Riley, etc. There's something to be said about how these characters represent a facet of the black experience. If Jasmine represents some form of black confusion, I think Huey very clearly represents some form of black frustration. No matter how many times Aaron says that Huey is this positive thinker, I'm going to be so honest, he really isn't. I'm going to be honest, he's not. I'm very loud about how I don't understand why people gravitate to Huey, despite his politics being so radical. But the truth of the matter is, it's because Huey, for many, represents a feeling. Being a black child that is unheard. Not wanting to be seen as just another token Negro. A quiet yet passionate child with a vision for the future. It's no wonder that a lot of young people gravitate towards Huey later down the line. But that's more a conversation for the televised show. What about now? In its genesis, the Boondocks rightfully carved out a name for itself. And there's something very raw and inspiring about how it chose to not only depict itself, but the types of stories it wanted to tell and the motivations behind it. Despite all the controversy, and believe me, there was controversy. We didn't cover it this time. The Boondocks at this point was facing several controversies. This is racist. This is too angry. Multiracial activists. People sending emails and messages telling him that his work just wasn't positive. It was too angry. And we'll explore some of those things in the next episode. For now, at its core, the Boondocks was sincere. And I think that sincerity bleeds through the pages and panels. So until next time, where we discuss deadlines, Afro-denial, and introduction to the school, some of the controversies and the turn of the new year, I guess I'll just see you next time. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Power to the people. Peace.